terrorists have been emboldened by this government.
Those who have left the comfortable confines of Canadian democracy to travel overseas and associate themselves with a terrorist cause will be pursued by Canadian justice.
Canadians actually want to know that terrorists will end up in jail, not walking on our streets and living in our communities.
We will pursue criminal prosecutions in every possible way we can. We've demonstrated that, Mr. Speaker, by actually doing it, where the previous government, while they talk a good game, failed to lay a single charge.
There are at least 13 Canadians currently being detained by Kurds in Syria on suspected ties to ISIS, according to reporting from Global News. The Kurds want Canada to take those people back. But as Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale told us yesterday, the government has no plans to do that. Does Canada have an obligation to bring those people home? Joining me by Skype from Toronto is Amarnath Amarasingham. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Hi, nice to see you again. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you know more about this subject than anyone I know. I'm wondering, you've been back a week now from Syria. What did you learn there that you didn't already know about Canadian foreign fighters?
I think what was interesting is a few things. I think one, it was interesting how few Canadian or a few officials from the Canadian government had actually been over there to interview our prisoners. I'd been under the assumption that there would be a kind of more interest in getting intel and stuff like that from our prisoners. But I guess it makes sense legally that the Canadian government doesn't really want to interfere too much in this process, partly because the prisoners are being held by the YPG, which contains the PKK, which is a kind of Kurdish organization which is listed as a terrorist entity in Canada. So it's not something that the Canadian government can so easily kind of negotiate with as if it was any other state actor. So that it kind of makes sense legally, but that was something that kind of caught me off guard initially when we went in, because a lot of the fighters were saying, and the women were saying, you guys are the first Canadians we've met. So that kind of caught me off guard in the beginning.
And how many, I know you sort of worked to ascertain some sort of number of these people being held by the Kurds. What number did you end up with?
There's 3 men, 3 women, and 7 children that we know of. I think there's probably a bit more in some other camps. There will likely be a few more prisoners, maybe as the Deir ez-Zor campaign comes to a close, which in a few weeks the Kurdish forces think they're going to capture the last kind of holdouts of ISIS within the next few weeks. So there might be some more Western prisoners there. All of the 7 children are under 5, and at least 3 or 4 of them are under the age of 1, which means that a few of them were even born in the camps after capture. And all of them, except 1 or 2, were born in ISIS territory.
How much more of a dilemma do you think that makes it, or do you, for the federal government, this idea that they were born there or that they are children?
I think for me, it's more of a moral question than a legal one. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how to think in those terms. But I think for me, visiting these camps, which are basically makeshift IDP camps, and the word camp makes it seem like they can come and go as they please. Of course, that's not the case. So it's kind of a camp prison. And they're basically small huts covered in tarp where, these women are being held along with their children. So in a small tent, it would be the woman and 2 to 3 of her kids. And winter is on the horizon in Syria in a month or so. And Syrian winters are pretty crazy. And so there's a real chance that, some of these kids might get sick or even could become deathly ill in some way in these camps. So I think for me anyway, it's a moral question of bringing some of the families back as soon as possible and charging them here or finding a way to reintegrate them here is a second issue, I think. But I think getting them out of those kinds of camps should be a priority. I should also add that the Kurdish authorities want them out of the country as well pretty quickly. The numbers we got there were, somewhere around 900 fighters, 500 women, and 1,000 children from 44 different countries. The Kurdish authorities don't want to care for them indefinitely, don't want them kind of living in their camps indefinitely. So they're also asking governments to take back their citizens as soon as possible. So I think there's a kind of argument to be made that we should bring our citizens back and charge them in our own countries quickly.
Okay, I had a chance to ask Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale yesterday about your work and Stuart Bell's work, and I want to play for the clip for you, and then I'll get your reaction. Is it your intention to bring those Canadians back? And
there is no such agreement. There is no commitment in that regard, as I've said before.
Why not?
These people left the comfortable confines of Canadian democracy to travel around the world to a war zone and to engage in the atrocious activities of terrorism. They made those decisions to do that, and they have to bear the consequences of their decisions.
So what do you think of the point he's making, essentially? And I think there would be a number of Canadians thinking about the activities that not the children, but the parents of these children engaged in, and sort of similarly saying, why should we bring them back? What do you say to that?
I mean, it's a sentiment that I understand, and I think a lot of I've heard it a lot over the last week from basically everybody that I speak to is just leave them there. What's the problem? They went there on their own accord. They often burned their passports in front of the camera. They actively renounced their Canadian citizenship, and now that they're captured, somehow their Canadian citizenship should be used to bring them back and charge them here. So, I mean, it's an argument that makes sense. It's an argument that I sympathize with. But I also think that morally and legally speaking, these are our citizens, and we kind of have an obligation to charge them here and have them face justice here. I also think, broadly speaking, in terms of the kind of campaign against terrorism more broadly, having people face justice here, having them in front of the courts, facing a fair trial, goes a long way to kind of communicating to other potentially radicalized individuals that this is how Canada does things. It doesn't just leave people to leave people alone in a tent city somewhere in the desert in Syria without any concern.
The minister seemed to indicate that without acquiring the evidence necessary to charge them when they're back here, that almost seemed to me, and I'm reading between the lines of what he said because he didn't say it directly, but that's what would be required for them to then go and try to bring them back. That bar for evidence, though, to press charges of terrorism is, as we both know, very, very high. What do you think of that argument, sort of not bringing them over until there is some sort of evidence to necessitate charges?
Yeah, I mean, the Syrian conflict, as much as it is the kind of most mediated conflict in history, is also a bit of a black hole. And so we don't know what a lot of these guys did when they were over there. We don't know, aside from their social media profiles, sometimes, that they were even over there. And I think a good defense attorney could poke holes in social media profiles, could also poke holes in the fact that these guys were being held by the SDF, which is made up of the PKK, which is, we consider to be a terrorist organization, i.e. they were probably tortured into confessing that they were members of ISIS and so on. So I think the legal case here is going to be an uphill battle for sure. But I fear that leaving them under SDF territory also has problems because the Kurds have made it clear that they're not going to keep them there indefinitely. They're not just going to house these prisoners over the next 10 years while everyone else gets their act together. The other 44 countries get their act together. That there are kind of plan Bs and plan Cs that they're discussing and thinking about. I'm worried what these plans might be if they're thinking about releasing them back into rebel territory or ISIS territory, if they're thinking about handing them over to the Assad regime, or if they're thinking about handing them over to what other kinds of forces that might be active in Syria. We're just going to have a kind of ongoing problem on our hands. If any of these kids end up dying in these camps, or if any of these men get tortured and killed by whatever forces are active in Syria, we might face wrongful death lawsuits and a whole other sorts of problems. So I think it's a kind of it's not consistent to say that somehow leaving them there is problem-free and we only encounter problems when we bring them back. I think both pose problems, but I think we have a kind of legal obligation, or maybe not a legal obligation, but a kind of moral obligation to bring them and charge them here just because they're our citizens. let me also add, I think there's a kind of added complication which I also sympathize with, which is that some of these women, when their husbands died, remarried and have kids with new husbands and so on. So I don't sympathize with the Canadian government, which has to kind of deal with this bureaucratically as well in terms of getting out ID documents or passport documents and things like that with children that we might not even really be sure are Canadian. And so there is a kind of added complexity of the nature of the conflict that was run by ISIS and the nature of how these relationships and things like that worked. That adds another layer of complication here.
Very complex all around. Thanks so much, Mr. Amaran Singh. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, the parents of a British-Canadian man accused of being a member of ISIS have written a letter to members of Parliament challenging a statement by opposition leader Andrew Scheer. Mr. Scheer raised the case of the man called Jihadi Jack in question period this week. Joining me now is the CBC's Mary Brewster. Hi, Mary. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Vashi.
Thanks for coming in. Tell me what's going on here.
Well, back in February, you may or may not recall that we wrote some stories about how Jack Letts, Jihadi Jack, was speaking with Canadian consular officials about getting him out and possibly coming to Canada. It's finally become a political issue, and it was in the House of Commons this week, and it was raised by Conservative Leader Andrew Scheer. So let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Why is this government proactively reaching out to a known terrorist fighter? This individual is a British citizen. It is unclear if he has ever spent any time in Canada. This government has reached out to try to bring him to Canada. Wow. He has an opportunity now to explain why.
Why?
Well, that has prompted a pretty furious reaction from his parents. They wrote to all members of Parliament today, and we got a copy of the letter right here, and I wanted to read just a portion of it. It's a really long letter, but it says that Jack is a known jihadi fighter is a blatant lie, and that he knows is untrue. Simply repeating a lie 4 times does not make it true. If Mr. Scheer has any evidence that our son is a known jihadi fighter, he has a duty to report this information to Canadian and British authorities. Now, what's interesting about this, Vashi, is the fact that John Letts, who wrote the letter to parliamentarians today, has already been in Canada, and he has attempted to meet with both the RCMP and CSIS because he says that he wanted to present evidence to them that his son is innocent. Now, naturally, parents are claiming that their son is innocent, but they wanted to present that evidence to Canadian authorities, and Canadian authorities didn't want to listen.
Interesting. I mean, they must have a reason why. But is there a response from Mr. Scheer at this point?
Well, there is, and our cameras caught up with Mr. Scheer in Toronto just a couple of minutes ago. Let's have a look at what he had to say.
People have to be accountable for their actions, and when we talk about naive kids, normally people think about stealing a car with the wrong group of friends or getting involved in some petty crimes, and that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a situation in Syria where the most heinous atrocities have been committed against ethnic minorities, against people of different faiths, and to have someone go and join and engage in that type of conflict, that's not just someone getting caught up in something. That's somebody who has to answer for what they've done.
So John Letts and his lawyer are going to be in Ottawa next week, and they're going to be pleading their case directly to the Canadian public and to the Canadian government.
Interesting. Okay, thanks a lot, Murray. Really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.